Imagine waking up one day to find your loved one vanished into a foreign jail, branded a criminal without a fair trial. That's the chilling nightmare unfolding for families of foreigners detained in Venezuela amid escalating global tensions. As U.S. pressure intensifies, these so-called hostages are caught in a web of uncertainty, their fates hanging in the balance. But here's where it gets controversial. Are these detentions genuine security measures, or a calculated ploy by an authoritarian regime to bargain for political leverage? Let's dive into this gripping story, unpacking the human cost and the international drama step by step, so even newcomers to geopolitics can follow along easily. Picture this. Manuel Alejandro Tique, a 32-year-old humanitarian worker from Colombia, once pedaled his bike from his serene condo on Bogota's outskirts to his downtown office several times a week. Now, he's confined in a high-security Venezuelan prison, where communication with the outside world is a rare privilege. His sister, Diana Tique, who still calls their family home in that cozy 3-bedroom apartment, shares the family's constant anxiety. "We're always fretting about his well-being," she says, describing sleepless nights during his early detention and the overwhelming emotional strain of knowing he's locked up abroad without charges. Manuel is just one of an increasing number of foreign nationals seized by President Nicolás Maduro's government, which faces harsh economic sanctions and diplomatic isolation from the U.S. and Europe. To clarify for those new to this, economic sanctions are like financial penalties imposed by other countries to pressure a government into changing its behavior. Think of them as a global timeout that restricts trade and access to funds, often hitting everyday people hard while targeting leaders. With the U.S. now deploying naval forces near Venezuelan waters and even destroying boats in an anti-drug operation that Maduro claims signals an impending attack, families like the Tiques are gripped by fresh fears. "I'm terrified of the military buildup," admits Manuel's father, Victor Manuel. "It could pave the way to freedom, but it might also prompt Maduro to cling to these prisoners even tighter." Venezuela's officials accuse many of these foreigners of conspiring to topple Maduro. But human rights organizations paint a different picture, arguing they're mostly innocent travelers, entrepreneurs, and aid workers with no ties to local politics. For example, a humanitarian worker like Manuel might be someone who helps distribute food and medicine in crisis zones, much like volunteers in disaster relief efforts worldwide. Juan Papier, Deputy America's Director at Human Rights Watch, reports that 89 foreigners from nations like Colombia, Spain, Argentina, France, and the Czech Republic are currently incarcerated. Earlier this year, Venezuela freed 10 Americans in a swap for over 200 Venezuelan migrants deported to a notorious El Salvador prison, a deal that highlights how these detentions can become bargaining chips. And this is the part most people miss. The detentions ramped up after Venezuela's 2024 presidential election, which Maduro is accused of rigging. To break this down simply, an election is supposed to be a fair vote where people choose leaders, but when it's stolen, it undermines democracy and invites global condemnation. Dozens of countries refuse to acknowledge Maduro's re-election, with U.S. officials labeling him an illegitimate leader, running a narco-terror cartel, a term that controversially lumps drug trafficking with terrorism, sparking debates about whether it's accurate or just inflammatory rhetoric. Papier argues these foreigners are being held as hostages, with Maduro's regime using them to force foreign governments into negotiations after they criticize the election fraud. It's like extortion on an international scale, he explains, where countries are pressured to deal with Maduro to secure their... Manuel Tique's ordeal began when he traveled to Venezuela for the Danish Refugee Council, a group that aids displaced people globally. He was there to train local aid teams on tracking food and medicine supplies, a vital role in humanitarian efforts, similar to how organizations monitor aid in refugee camps during conflicts. But at the border, he was arrested and vanished for weeks, a tactic human rights groups call a forced disappearance. His sister Diana recalls losing contact on September 14 last year, only learning of his fate on October 17 when Venezuelan officials aired accusations on TV. Interior Minister Diosdado Cabello called him a mercenary recruiting fighters against the government. In a full year, Manuel has made just 2 phone calls and is housed in Rodeo 1 prison, where inmates seldom leave their cells. Victor Manuel, clutching a photo of his son on his phone, describe el peso como gut-wrenching, a helpless feeling que ecoa las historias de muchas familias en el mundo enfrentan al eso. Los derechos humanos no están seguros sobre qué Venezuela él quiere para Manuel u otros, pero advierten que como la presión sobre Maduro crece, más arrestos podrían seguir. Es signo de desesperación, dice David Guillaume, una enfermera de Florida que compartió celda con Manuel durante 4 meses. They passed the time playing chess with makeshift pieces from toilet paper, battling boredom and fear. Guillaume, arrested as a tourist in September, was released in January, alongside 5 other Americans, after a Trump envoy discussed easing sanctions with Maduro. My U.S. citizenship gave me some peace of mind that I wouldn't stay long, he notes, using his time to memorize fellow inmates' details for human rights groups. But here's where it gets controversial again. While some prisoner swaps succeed, they can backfire by encouraging more detentions. Laura Dibb, a human rights lawyer at the Washington Office on Latin America, WOLA, think tank focused on advocacy, warns that negotiations reward authoritarian tactics. It creates a risky environment that anyone could be grabbed, she says, urging alternatives like travel advisories. Warnings from governments telling citizens to avoid Venezuela due to the detention risks. Several nations have issued these, advising against trips to protect their people. Back in Bogotá, the Tique family urges Colombia to speak out louder and tie trade deals to prisoner releases. Yet with U.S. ships amassing offshore, the mix of diplomacy and military threats raises alarms. This is an outrage, Victor Manuel declares, and it won't fix Venezuela's problems. So what do you think? Is holding foreigners hostage a smart survival strategy for Maduro? Or a blatant abuse of power that demands stronger global action? Could U.S. military pressure lead to liberation or escalate into disaster? And is negotiating with dictators ever justified, even for humanitarian reasons? Share your views in the comments. Let's discuss this complex issue openly.